I'm Su Ping Chan and this is World Business Report on the BBC World Service. It's the start of a new business week in Asia, and for the next half hour we'll bring you all the latest business news from around the world. All producing countries are preparing to meet to discuss production cuts, but how will positive news on a COVID vaccine shape the talks? We'll also hear from Lebanon. It's a country in the middle of an economic crisis and many doctors are leaving.
It is devastating. To recruit a scholar or a good, well-established physician, on average, it took me 18 months. These people are not going to come back now.
And exam nerves are mounting in South Korea as 500,000 teenagers prepare for a 10-hour marathon exam. So what's at stake? That's all coming up after a bulletin of the latest world news.
BBC News with Sue Montgomery. Donald Trump has attacked the FBI and the US Department of Justice, accusing them of working against him in his efforts to overturn the result of the presidential election. He was speaking in his first interview since Joe Biden was declared the winner more than 3 weeks ago. Mr. Trump suggested he would never accept that he was beaten. Our correspondent in Washington, Nomia Iqbal, says the president also repeated unsubstantiated claims of voter fraud.
He didn't provide any evidence at all, and he hasn't done so far. And just this morning, Wisconsin, a state that he is challenging, has reconfirmed that Joe Biden won the state. Donald Trump had to legally pay for that recount. It was a partial recount involving 2 counties in Wisconsin, Dane County and Milwaukee County. And it actually increased Joe Biden's lead. So Donald Trump effectively paid $3 million to increase Joe Biden's lead.
Medical experts have warned that America's severe coronavirus outbreak is likely to get even worse as millions travel home after the Thanksgiving holiday. Anthony Fauci said there could be a surge upon a surge in cases. There are record numbers of patients in US hospitals with COVID-19. Speaking to NBC's Meet the Press, Dr. Fauci urged Americans to avoid large social gatherings.
If we can hang together as a country and do these kinds of things to blunt these surges until we get a substantial proportion of the population vaccinated, we can get through this. There really is light at the end of the tunnel.
Diego Maradona's doctor is being investigated for possible manslaughter following the death of the Argentine football legend earlier this week. Police in Buenos Aires searched Leopoldo Luque's house and private clinic for evidence of negligence. Maradona died of a heart attack days after being discharged from hospital. Dr. Luque insisted he'd done all he could to save his life. The WHO has warned that progress in the fight against malaria appears to have stalled. The disease kills about 400,000 people every year. It's feared a shortage of funds for anti-malaria programs will be worsened by the pandemic. Imogen Folks reports.
20 years ago, African governments signed a pledge to reduce malaria deaths by half within a decade. That commitment has, the WHO estimates, prevented 1.5 billion cases of malaria and saved 7.6 million lives. But annual progress has slowed. The number of deaths over the last 2 years is virtually unchanged at just over 400,000. Case numbers have hovered at around 230 million annually for the past 4 years.
World News from the BBC. In Brazil, the mayor of Rio de Janeiro, a controversial evangelical Christian preacher, has lost his bid for re-election in a runoff poll. Marcelo Crivella, who is President Jair Bolsonaro's preferred candidate, won 35% of votes. In Brazil's largest city, Sao Paulo, the centrist mayor, Bruno Covas, has been re-elected, despite criticism of his handling of the pandemic. Aid workers have urged the Ethiopian government to allow humanitarian supplies into the Tigray region after the authorities asserted that more than 3 weeks of fighting was over. The International Committee of the Red Cross has warned that a major hospital in the main city, Mekele, is dangerously low in supplies. A close ally of the Hungarian Prime Minister has removed an article in which he compared the Hungarian-born Jewish philanthropist George Soros to Adolf Hitler. Szilárd Demeter admitted he may have caused harm to the memory of Nazi victims and has deleted his Facebook account. His comments had sparked sharp condemnation from opposition parties and Israel. Here's Nick Thorpe.
In his comments on Origo, a staunchly pro-government website, he had called Europe George Soros's gas chamber and described the Poles and Hungarians as the new Jews of Europe, a reference to the ongoing dispute between the two countries and the majority of EU member states over the rule of law. Mr. Soros is of Jewish background, survived the Holocaust and is frequently attacked by the Orban government.
The Formula One driver Romain Grosjean has said he's grateful for new safety measures introduced by the sport after surviving a horrific crash at the Bahrain Grand Prix. His car smashed through barriers, broke in two and burst into flames. Speaking from his hospital bed, he put his survival down to a cockpit protection system. He had opposed its introduction 2 years ago. BBC News.
Hello and welcome to World Business Report. I'm Su-Ping Chan. On the programme today, oil producers meet this week to discuss production cuts, but will a recent rise in prices last? We'll also hear how Lebanon's economic crisis has accelerated the country's medical brain drain, and the exam that's so important that even the police get involved.
Sometimes police cars escort the children. They ring the siren and people kind of realize that it's some kind of an emergency, pretty much to do with the exam.
Let us know what you think of the programme. Email us at world.business@bbc.co.uk. A string of successful coronavirus vaccine trials has raised hopes that life will start getting back to normal next year. The prospect of economies opening up with more planes in the sky and factories back at full steam has helped to push up oil prices. Oil-producing nations meet this week against this brighter backdrop. The so-called OPEC Plus club, including Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Iraq and non-OPEC member Russia, will decide whether to roll existing cuts of 7.7 million barrels per day, or around 8% of global demand, into the first few months of 2021. Ellen Ward is a consultant and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. What does she expect from the meeting?
Most people are expecting, and I'm among them, that both OPEC and the larger OPEC Plus group will agree to extend their current quotas, probably for another 2 or 3 months. Right now, they're actually scheduled to increase production by 2 million barrels per day starting January 1. So if the group decides to basically delay that planned increase, they will keep their current quotas for the first few months of 2021.
The recent successful COVID vaccine trials have helped to buoy the oil market. How will this play into the talks?
I think is a significant component of the talks and has given some weight to those producers that really don't want to continue to curb their production this much. What's interesting is that as soon as the vaccine news hit the market, oil prices really did start to rise. We've seen Brent pushing $50 a barrel. The issue at hand, though, is that the fundamentals are still not very good, at least for the first couple months of 2021. We've got very low demand, particularly from Europe and the United States. Europe is basically locked down, and in the United States, there are a lot of states that have locked down, and we've just got very low driving and flying demand overall.
There are big differences in how different parts of the world are recovering, for example, in countries like the UK and the US versus in Asia, where economies are more open. And there's also a difference between petrol and diesel demand versus jet fuel demand, which I think is at 50% of normal levels. How will that play into how the global economy recovers?
That's a huge issue. And what we're seeing in China is that the Chinese have really leaned in to industrial production in their recovery recovery as opposed to focusing on consumer recovery. And so they are still consuming a good amount of gasoline and diesel. As you mentioned, not so much jet fuel. There's really nothing you can do when international travel is so depressed. China has issued new export quotas for its independent refineries. So basically, these refineries were waiting. They'd used up all their quotas, and they were waiting on the government to provide them with new quotas for exports so they could begin using more crude oil. And that's gotten started. So Chinese demand could be fairly strong for the end of 2020 and into 2021. And that's definitely something that the suppliers of oil to China, Saudi Arabia is a big supplier, UAE is looking at this as well, are really eyeing. And I think that Saudi Arabia's perspective is, let's see global oil stocks draw down because of this before we throw more oil into the market, whereas the UAE is saying, hey, we've got an opportunity to provide more oil to a growing economy.
Have OPEC members been sticking to previously agreed cuts and quotas? And if not, has this caused any tensions?
It really depends. There are some members that have been very good in sticking to their quotas. Saudi Arabia is one of them. Russia has been pretty good, which was a surprise since they weren't very good about it in the past. But Iraq basically has never adhered to its quotas. It's really in a very difficult situation because it needs to sell oil to make money. Otherwise, the government will basically fall apart. And so they have curbed their production a bit, but not nearly enough to satisfy the Saudis. Nigeria has also been an issue. And surprisingly, the UAE actually violated its quota earlier in the year, but they promised to curb production a bit extra in the end of this year. So that diffused tensions on that end.
Ellen Wald. Now, the pandemic means governments have been ripping up the rule book when it comes to spending money and getting out their checkbooks to support the economy. But what does all that extra cash mean for prices in the shops? Fresh inflation data out later this week will tell us more. Independent economist Michael Hughes has been telling me what to expect.
Well, I think it's a continuation of what we've seen in the last few months, that the normal measure of inflation, the sort of CPI, remains well under control, probably less than 1%. But house price inflation does seem to be pretty buoyant. And Australia, it's over 6%. In the US, it's over 9%. In the UK, it's over 7%. So you've got a big differential between what's happening in the housing market and what's happening in inflation throughout the economy. And if that was allowed to gather momentum, you could end up having a house price bubble, which would be very distorting to the economy and also actually adding to some of the political pressures, because quite clearly there's already a sense that younger people can't even own or indeed even rent housing. And so the pressure will be on to make sure that this housing bubble doesn't get out of control.
Do you think policymakers should address runaway house prices?
Well, what I found interesting is that the New Zealand Central Bank is being asked to look at whether it should actually now control house price inflation as well as general inflation. Now, the relevance of that is that the New Zealand authorities were the first ones to give independence to their central bank. And that obviously was followed by other central banks worldwide. So the idea that they're now trying to increase the remit of their central bank to say, well, it's not just the consumer price inflation we want you to control, we actually want you to control the housing market as well. Now, that may just be a bit of a political trick, but it might also suggest that we're going into a very different era where the remit of the central banks begins to change.
Central banks have been printing a lot of money. They've been using that money to buy bonds. Those asset purchases have pumped up asset prices. That includes house prices. So do you think central banks have been adding to the problem in some ways?
Well, I think to some degree, when you've had this degree of money printing, you're quite likely to have some response by the asset markets. And I think that to some degree that is to be expected. Having said that, the banks are not yet acting in a way that they're allowing credit to get out of control. So if you're putting money into the economy, the real problems come when actually the credit supply gets out of control, and that isn't happening yet. And I think banks, rather than central banks, are actually behaving quite sensibly, partly because they remember 10 years ago they weren't behaving very sensibly and they allowed things to get out of control.
If we look at prices as a whole, governments at the moment are spending a lot of money to support the economy. Central banks are printing a lot of it. Do you think higher inflation in general is a threat in the future?
I think it is getting to be a bigger risk. If you look what's happening in the commodity markets rather than just the asset markets, you've seen industrial commodities and indeed oil prices start to pick up recently, and they are a lead indicator of what may happen to consumer prices a year or so down the line. So it is quite conceivable that this time next year, many Western economies will find that their inflation rate is higher than the targets that have been set for central banks, rather than the situation we've had now for several years, where inflation has come in well below those targets. And if that is the case, then the pressure will be on central banks to say, well, hang on a moment, should we now do something? And the question then is, if they start raising interest rates, given the level of debt that's in the economy, that could prove very destabilising for 2 or 3 years down the line.
Michael Hughes there. You're listening to World Business Report on the BBC World Service. Now, for decades, the Lebanese capital Beirut has been a hub for medical tourism and was even known for attracting the brightest and best doctors. But years of political and economic instability have taken their toll. The number of doctors per 10,000 people have dropped from around 29 in 2000 to 21 in 2018. Dr. Fouad Boulos is a Lebanese doctor and now another brain drain statistic. He left the country for the second time earlier this month.
My history has been one of attachment and dedication to Lebanon. I came for residency to the United States on a green card and actually came for an interview for citizenship at the end of my residency, and I did not get the passport because I could not say yes to the questions that were asked to me about letting go of Lebanon and defending the United States. Instead, if the opportunity or if the circumstances, forced me to pick between the United States and Lebanon. So I went back home. My dedication to Lebanon was put severely to the test when I saw this house of cards crumbling in front of my eyes. I had hope. I thought that my presence in Lebanon would be much more useful to the Lebanese than my presence in the United States would be useful to the Americans. When the revolution started, I was actually hopeful. It was a time of excitement and anticipation of better things. However, a month into it, I realized that it was all an illusion.
It's a similar story across the region. In Egypt, the number of doctors in government hospitals has fallen by a third over the past 5 years. Dr. Ghazi Zatari is the interim dean of medicine at the American University of Beirut. Over the past decades, he's hired more than 200 scientists and doctors in Lebanon, but now many are leaving.
In the Faculty of Medicine, as of last week, I had 42 faculty members who have applied for leaves, or even some of them resign. So that's a large number, and that's very alarming to me as an interim dean, to the president of the university, as well as the trustees.
Why do they say they're leaving, and where are they going?
The large majority of them are coming to North America. Unfortunately, the region right now is in turmoil, or has been in turmoil. So this has been destabilizing, and Lebanon is caught in the middle, and it's a weak country. Now, back to your question, what makes people leave? There are several factors. I think the very first one, you need some political stability and financial stability. These are two key things. The financial crisis has really impacted individuals tremendously. While physicians are being paid, but their money is caught in the banking system. So you could be making enough income, but if you have no access. And quite often many of these have financial obligations. They would have their dependents studying in the US or living abroad, and they need to support them.
What do you think this exodus has done to Lebanon and other countries' healthcare systems? And do you think the damage will be long-lasting?
It is devastating. I mean, we're losing a lot of talent. These were people who were exceptional. So to see them leaving, it will have an impact because some of these is going to be hard bringing them back. It will take an average. I mean, I've been the associate dean for the past 10 years and I've been active in the recruitment process. To recruit a scholar or a good, well-established physician, on average, it took me 18 months. So this will have a devastating. These people are not going to come back now before there is some political stability, financial stability with reassurance. The Lebanese now have lost all trust in the banking system.
But in terms of long-term damage, what are we looking at here?
Oh, it's going to be serious because right now many hospitals are incapable of carrying on with the ability to maintain supply and also loss of resources, human resources. You know, there are these people right now, for example, many hospitals are incapable of finding enough medical supply. Even the challenge for us is the ability to generate what we call in our jargon, the fresh dollars. That is, dollars that you're capable to wire out of the country to buy the medical supply and equipment that you need to carry on with your duties. But as far as the total healthcare system in the country is going to be very, very seriously challenged. I think many of these institutions will close doors. I think added to all of this is the COVID pandemic, which has added an additional dimension to the challenge within the country.
How has all of this affected you personally?
I'm heartbroken to see all these people leaving because I was instrumental in recruiting them. People are hurting, not only the employees, but even patients. I mean, we have these patients coming in to have procedures done and trying to help them in paying their bills. Medical students, tuition fees today are a big challenge. Last year, since January, when I took office as an interim dean, a good part of my work has been trying to raise funds for the medical students. So this is, to me, is also painful. I mean, these patients are suffering. You talk about these cancer patients, those that, many of their medications are very expensive. The government is incapable of providing all these medications because, again, of limited funding. It's trying to do its best, but it's not going to be enough. So this is to me is what makes me, on one hand, very disheartened, saddened, but at the same time, an impetus to me to carry on trying to help people as much as I can. Now, you may ask how long you're going to be able to do it. I'll try to do it as long as I can. Now, unless it gets to be a safety issue, but so far until today, I'm determined with my team to carry on to support these people in need for our help and support. We cannot give up. I mean, that's the dogma on which this institution has been founded more than 150 years ago, and we're not ready to give it up.
Dr. Ghazi Zatari there. Now, do you remember the last time you took an exam? For me, it was a very, very long time ago, but I still remember those exam nerves, especially as there was so much riding on just one test. Well, spare a thought for around 500,000 teenagers across South Korea. This Thursday, they'll sit down for a 10-hour exam marathon. It's called the Suneung, and they've been preparing for it their entire lives. It determines their chance to go to the nation's top universities and therefore their job prospects and future. We asked some students how they felt about the exam.
My name is Chen Young-yoon. I will be taking the Suneung this Thursday, and I feel nervous and anxious right now. Also, with the COVID-19 situation getting more serious in Korea, we are required to wear masks at all times. I hope this does not make me dizzy during the exam. In Korea, the university that you graduated represents who you are in society, and doing well on the Suneung is a ticket to getting into a prestigious school.
Hello, my name is Lynn, and I will be taking Suneung next week. I do believe that Suneung is important in my future life. The type of university you go through is actually the first impression that people get when entering a company or when meeting new people. They constantly introduce themselves by using the university.
My name is S.J. Lee. I'm 22 years old, and I took Suneung 3 years ago. I still have nightmares about that day. I tried my best, but my scores were lower than expected. So I couldn't go to the university of my choice. I sometimes think that my life would be different if I got better score that day. I think 수능 score is directly related to a Korean person's success in life.
Nemo Kim is a journalist based in the South Korean capital Seoul. Was she surprised by what those students thought?
Not at all. I think any Korean would know how important the Suning score would be in their life. As the students said, it's the most important exam that a person takes in their entire life here in Korea. It decides what kind of impression they make on people. Not just that, but basically their job prospects in the future.
So tell me a bit more about the history of the Suning. How did it become such a big deal?
The current version actually started around 20 years ago, but Korea's always had different versions of the exam. So even my mother, who's over 70, took a similar kind of exam at the same age. Pretty much after Korea became modernized, the exam came into place.
And they actually stop traffic, don't they, so students can concentrate?
Air traffic is stopped during the English language listening part, and also for those who find themselves going to the exam a little bit late, then sometimes police cars escort the children. They ring the siren and people kind of realize that it's some kind of an emergency, pretty much to do with the exam.
What happens if it all goes wrong? Can you take it again?
You can take it again, but you would need to retake the exam a year later at the same time. So that would be a year out of somebody's life, just studying away. And also the psychological impact is quite serious, because you know that you're a year behind and you would be taking, like a different version of the exam with people who are a year younger than you. There are special academies for people who are retaking the exam, kind of boarding school style academies, kind of in the middle of nowhere so that they don't have distractions.
How has COVID impacted this year's exam?
Well, it's been really difficult and confusing. A lot of these students sometimes were able to have regular teaching. Some other times they were taught online. The Ministry of Education here tried to make it as easy as possible, especially for those taking the exam this year. But it's not been very easy for them, because they didn't know until a few weeks ago if those who were on quarantine can take the exam or not. Well, it's finally been decided that they can take the exams, but in a different place, in a different location. But I think the worst thing for those taking the exam this year is that they have to have the mask on for 10 hours of all the time that they are taking the exams. I know that a lot of the students are actually currently practicing wearing a mask for such long hours.
With so much riding on just one exam, have there been any calls to reform how students are tested?
Yes, of course. There have been many calls for reform on how to maybe, change the exam, because this is, as I said, the most important thing that a person has to go through in their entire life here in Korea. But because we have over 70% of the population going to university, it's one of the highest, if not the highest, percentage of people getting higher education among OECD countries. Bureaucratically, I think it's really difficult to find another method that works for everybody, that has the same level of fairness. So although there have been many calls for change, it's really difficult, I think, to come up with an alternative that will satisfy everybody.
Journalist Nemo Kim, ending this edition of World Business Report. Good luck to anyone taking the sunung in South Korea this Thursday. From me, for now, bye-bye.